finally, the very last thing we need to talk about for the whole class is going to be stereotype threat. Stereotype threat falls in your book under something called the self-fulfilling consequences of stereotypes, where stereotype threat, let's define it. So basically what's happening here is that whenever there's a negative stereotype about you and you're going to be evaluated on that, you actually don't do well. All right. So, so let me give you an example of how this works. So, there's been a lot of research on, let's say, just the basic intelligence, and what they found is that whites score significantly better than blacks on standardized tests like the ACT, the SAT, things like that. And so on this general IQ test as well, white people score better than black people. And so what's going to happen now for stereotypes, so everyone knows this. This is kind of, at this point in the game, it's kind of just no knowledge that black people do not test as well as white people. And so what's going to happen is, let's pretend you are a black person. And let's say you're going to go take this test. You're going to go take the SAT. What's going to happen is you are going to be aware of that stereotype because you're a black person taking a test. And you're going to be evaluated on that. And what's going to happen is you now have this idea in your mind that's like, yeah, I know the stereotype exists, but I'm the exception. I'm going to debunk this stereotype so much that it's going to be, I'm going to be the one to fix it. You put all of that stereotype weight on your shoulders. And what happens is when you do that, there's so much pressure, you actually don't do well on the test. And therefore, you actually confirm the original stereotype. That's why it's called self-fulfilling prophecy. All right? So the first study that really did this was by Steele and Aronson. Claude Steele is one of the most well-respected social psychologists in the world. Unfortunately, he doesn't do research anymore. He's actually a dean, either at Yale or Brown or one of these really good schools. But he stopped being a psychologist and started working in administration. So, which is a real shame in my opinion. So here's what they did. They brought in black and white participants, and what their job to do, these participants, was to complete the SAT math problems. And now participants were randomly assigned, and they were told that the test that they're taking, this math test, was either diagnostic or not. Diagnostic means it counts. Non-diagnostic means it's just basically a practice. So we have a 2x2 design. Okay. The first independent variable is your race. Are you black or are you white? The second independent variable is the test for practice or for real? And this right here is your test performance. And what they see is that when the test is non-diagnostic, so it's for practice, you see no difference in SAT math scores between black and white participants. However, the second that you're told you're diagnostic, there's a drop such that black participants score much worse than white participants. And if you look here, this is an example where we have an interaction and we have two main effects. All right. And what's happening very clearly is that the second you make a test of intelligence, diagnostic, stereotype threat kicks in. The black people in this study are just like, oh, I need to debunk the myth, debunk the stereotype. And that's so much pressure on them that they actually perform worse. Now, what this leads me to believe is that the stereotype that black people are not as smart as white people is actually wrong. Look here. Those means are identical. Black and white people are equally as smart, in my opinion. But what's happening here is that because of that pressure from the stereotype threat, whenever the test is diagnostic, you see a drop like that. And that drop is stereotype threat. All right. Now, what Steele and Anderson wanted to do next was figure out, okay, is this just a black-white thing or what's going on? So what they did in another study, Spencer, Steele, and Quinn, what they did is now instead of making the test diagnostic or not, they did the same SAT math problems. Instead of black and white, though, they had male and female. And the stereotype here is that men are better at math than women. All right? And now, before the test, these participants were randomly assigned to be told that there are sex differences in math or that men and women are basically equal and that it's a myth. right? So once again, we have another 2x2 design. And what they showed is that when there's told that there's no difference between men and women, that sex difference thing in math is made up, you see no difference there, no statistically significant difference. Okay? But the second you're told that there is a difference, stereotype threat kicks in. Women feel this urge to do better and to debunk that myth. And sure enough, what you see is a drop. Men, on the other hand, have an increase. It's kind of like a confidence boost for them. You see the interaction there. But the men bar, who cares? What's really interesting is this dip right here, right? That is the stereotype threat. That is what happens when you, this is what happens when women are under the belief that women are worse at math than men. So here's a math test. And then women are probably thinking, oh, I got to prove them wrong. I'll show them. I'm just as good as math as any of these other boys. And sure enough, here you go. All right, sure enough, here you go. Now, the question is, what do we do about this? Can we fix stereotype threat? So there's two issues we need to talk about, and then we're all done. Issue number one is, can you stop stereotype threat? And the answer is yes. There are research has shown two ways to do it. The first was done by Steele himself. So the first was done by Claude Steele. And what he did in his research, this is when he was at the University of Michigan. What he did is he brought in black students. And these black students are at the University of Michigan. And these black students were kind of targeted because they had lower than optimal or lower than average SAT scores, but they still got into Michigan. And what Claude Steele did with them is he met with them for weeks, like the whole semester. They would have weekly meetings where they would talk about the stereotypes that exist in their culture and how they're not true, and how what stereotype threat is, and how test performance can be influenced. And they would work on solving math problems together and just practicing their skills. And this is what Claude Steele did for an entire semester. He met with them. And what he found is that at the end of the semester, these black students who were a part of his program scored similarly to their white peers. The black students who were not in this stereotype threat program, they did not do as well compared to their white peers. And basically, in other words, you can teach people what stereotype threat is and teach them how to debunk it. And that's exactly what Steele did. But notice how much time that took. We're talking a semester's 16 weeks? 16 weeks of weekly meetings for hours long every week. That is a lot of time and a lot of effort. And it's just something that Steele did. But he empirically showed with data, that if you're a black student in this program, your scores on intelligence tests and your grades at the University of Michigan are comparable to your white peers. The same, and if the black student who was eligible for this program but not in it for space reasons, they didn't do as well. Right? So that's one way to do it. But there's another way to fix stereotype threat. Now, I feel really bad because I forget the name of this researcher. I heard him talk when I was in graduate school. He's at the University of Iowa, and he was doing fascinating research on stereotype threat, where what he just did is mess with the order of the questions. So if you are, if you remember taking the SAT or the ACT or whatever standardized test you took to get into Gettysburg College, you probably remember that the first questions that you got asked are, what is your sex, ethnicity, age, just your demographics. Well, what this researcher argued is that by indicating your race, by indicating your sex on these demographic questionnaires, you're being primed. You're priming yourself about your sex and your race. And at the second you're primed, stereotype threat's going to kick in. And so what he did was simple. He gave black and white people the SAT. Okay, but he moved the demographic questions to the end instead of the beginning. And so black and white people took the SAT just like normal, and then afterwards they did the demographic questionnaire where they were primed with their race. And what they found is that black and whites did similarly on these measures when the demographic questionnaire was at the end. If the demographic questionnaire was at the beginning, you saw the typical stereotype threat effects, right? So it's all about this priming. If you're primed with race or primed with sex, your gender, that becomes an issue. And that's when stereotype threat gets primed, and that's when the effects get kicked in. All right, so that's issue number one, is how do we stop it? Steele did this lengthy treatment thing that worked really well, but this other researcher, and I forget his name, and you will not need to know his name for the test, but you may need to know the overall effect, is that if you just move the demographic questionnaires to the end, you're not primed with your stereotype anymore. Okay, so that's issue number one, is can we stop it? Issue number two is what happens if you are like living a dual stereotype world. Like, for example, the stereotype exists that men are better than women at math, okay? But the stereotype also exists that Asians are better at math than whites. So what happens if you're an Asian woman? All right, what happens if you're an Asian woman? Well, what researchers did is just that. They had Asian women come in, and they had them do a math test. And what happens was, if you prime an Asian woman with her womanhood, all right, so you make her aware that she's a woman, then the traditional stereotype threat from effects, you see them. All right, so it's the Spencer, Steele, and Quinn. You see those effects. However, if you prime an Asian woman with her Asianness, all right, then your math score improves, and you're better, and you score better than the white person. So what's happening here is, what this tells us is that stereotype threat is all about the priming. It's all about what you're being primed with that influences your stereotypes. And it makes sense that stereotypes are therefore cognitive. If you prime your stereotype threat, if you prime a stereotype, what's going to happen is, think about what's going to happen. Nodes are going to be active, then spreading activation, then scripts. And then you are kind of now, like, the script is going to be like, I'm going to debunk this myth. Like, F them, I'm going to get them. Like, you think I'm a woman and I can't do math? Let me show you. That is the script you're being primed with. But that script comes with baggage. And that baggage is, you have a lot of pressure now. You are representing the entire, gender of women on your back, based on this one math test, and that makes you do poorly if you're primed with your womanhood for a math test. And what we show is we can combat this. We can combat it easily if we could just make these simple changes. And that's going to be it. So that's the last lecture video. So what we'll do is, I believe I will be sending you an email shortly regarding how to kind of the rules for the final exam, and that'll be it.